Thanks for joining the session. We are also live on my Facebook page. Our panelist today is then an acknowledged expert in specialist in the areas of political science, public policy development and analysis, history and political economy and heritage. He is a recognized leading public commentator on politics, policy, economic, social and heritage issues in major South African and international media forums. He was twice voted the best political analyst in South African media. He is a director of special project and advisor to the Vice Chancellor at UNISA. He is involved in researching and writing books and articles on various heritage, political, economic, and social issues, including African children's stories. He recently co-founded and convened the Inkulamti South African Scenarios 2030. He has received numerous awards in South Africa and abroad for community involvement, including an honorary chieftaincy, which was bestowed on him in Ghana. He holds a BA and BA honors from the former University of Transkei, Masters from the Queen's University in Canada, a PhD from Michigan State University, the USA. From Lugolweni village in the Alfred Nzo district in the Eastern Cape. His motto is live your dream no matter what circumstances you may be placed in. He's very passionate community development activist and has initiated a numerous community development and charity organizations to assist the poor and disadvantaged in rural communities. Colleagues, we are so honored to have him as our panelist on this topic of depoliticization, the capable state. Let the best amongst us serve in the public. It is going to be a very interactive session whereby after his questions from fellow participants. So in the meantime, we're able to make some inputs and comments and questions when it's finished. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give our panelist, Dr. Somato Tafikeni, an opportunity to make his presentation for today. Over to you, Prof. Somato Tafikeni.
Well, thank you very much, Sediko Rakolote, not only for inviting me, but also for this very important initiative. Because in the era of knowledge economies, we do need 1,000 flowers blooming in terms of thoughts, innovation, in terms of reflection. We can't move to the future unthinkingly. And you have identified one of the most important subjects that have been actually debated in the country, within the ruling party, in the opposition, and by many observers around the world. And in South Africa, it may have its own common localized nomenclature, which sometimes is called cadre deployment. And in essence, I do think that I want to start by saying, if we are to talk of depoliticization of the public service in order to build a capable state, there is an assumption there that politicization itself has not been good for our own democratic transition as such. And that is the first assumption that we lay forward to say, indeed, globally, you do have political deployees, but these are usually your political appointments by the way of cabinet ministers, by the way of, advisors of ministers, and in other countries, even some of the selected positions within the administration. So political deployment in itself is not necessarily something that is uncommon around the world. You see this right across the world. What is the problem? It's when the entire public service then is skewed into the political, appointments, and it is politicized as such. That's where the challenge is. The second assumption would be to say, if you depoliticize, something better would come out of it. And very often people talk of professionalization of a meritocratic state or public service. And that in itself is juxtaposed with a politicized state, which is often described in patronage networks of political world that we talk of. Let me start by saying many studies, including the Indlulamity scenario, South Africa scenarios 2030, that I convene, has indicated that one of the most important elements in any nation building, in any developmental project, will always be a capable state which has institutional capacity to implement policies, which has the institutional capacity to even carry the state when politics is still unstable. We've seen this in other countries like Israel, like Italy, and so forth, where you find that coalition governments collapse every 18 months, but the state still continue to function because it has professionalized public service. And there is institutional memory to actually continue with the work of the state. That in itself is key to say, even when politics happen to be unstable, fragile, the professionalization of public service often comes in handy to assist. Many studies have also gone further to indicate that almost all developmental states are recognized by having strong political leadership, which is visionary in sense, which is able to drive a program of long-term vision. As you saw Deng Xiaoping in China setting out 50-year plan for China development, which is still being followed to this day in its various phases. So strong leadership is one key driver. But under the strong leadership, you must have a strong, capable institution or institutional arrangement. That's where we talk of capable public service. And this institutional arrangement might be in the private sector, might be in different other places, but the public service one, because it deals with the broader society, it deals with public good, becomes very, very much important. Once you have weaknesses at the level of leadership, you have weaknesses at the level of public service, then you are likely going to have weaknesses in the state itself. You end up with a weak state, and in worst case scenario, you end up with a failed state. Even if you are hoping for economic growth or economic prosperity, without a strong institutional capacity of the state, without a strong leadership, those two things, you can't go any further. Of course, I'll talk later about a capable citizenry and a civic activism, which also holds the state accountable, because that is another third leg that is important in terms of capacities. So before we can even get into this particular issue of depoliticization of public service, we must first ask ourselves, in what form in South Africa do we have politicization of public service, and how did it come about? And then once we've done that diagnosis, it is easier to come up with some prescriptions on how then these challenges can be resolved, because we know what the problem is. It is often very important that we must first know the problem, we must define the model alternative, and we must come up with a strategy on how to move from as is to what ought to be. The first thing that happened in South Africa, which I think might be at the heart of what we see now as a politicized public service, was the fact that the ruling party very often may not have understood or appreciated the notion of the separation of state and party, even though there ought to be an organic link between the two. Once there is no clear reflection on how the two should be separated such that you are able to know where the party influences the state and where the state actually reciprocates. The more recent travel to Harare to meet ZANU-PF on a state plane is one of the indications of sometimes a lapse and a failure to understand that the statehood and the party and the partisan program may not necessarily fuse in a constitutional democracy and a multi-party system that we have. So that's the first thing that I think might have happened, because over the years in exile elsewhere, they might have been exposed to the ideologies where you had one-party state, where you had the fusion of state because you had a communist party ruling the entire state. So there, the state and the party were the singular thing. Some might have been exposed to personal rule, where the strong man overrides institutional considerations. So those are the early incarnations. The reason this problem of politicization of public service initially was not immediately detected is actually far more complex. Initially, you'll remember that the first 5 years, there was the sunset clause, which was saying absorb those from the old apartheid regime, absorb those from the old Bandustan regimes into the public service, and then include the new incoming people, some who were in the mass democratic movement, some who were in exile. So during that time, there was some degree of dilution where you had balance of all these. So you couldn't immediately see the political deployment on a wider scale and on a rapid scale. But later on, a number of things do happen. Our economy, even during the time of growth, did not deliver as much as it ought to have delivered. So because of that, it then left many people who wanted to be in different spaces, left with one option: you join the political party, you join government in order to access resources, public resources, where entrepreneurship wasn't working as well, where social entrepreneurship wasn't working as well, where many NGOs, some of them, were defunded when the country became democratic. So many people were beginning to look at the state. They were beginning to look at political parties as the only way for social mobility, as the only way of quickly accessing resources, as the only way at times to rise without being demanded to produce a certificate, sit for an interview, and so forth. Very often people then use that to get to government. And once in government, some of them use that to get into management or public service positions, hence the deployments of the political cadres. Very often at the beginning, this also was not immediately detected as a problem as such, precisely because at that time, you had very strong leaders who were capable, who had the experience. Hence, when you see after the ANC rupture in Polokwane, some of them being kicked out because the party had become more factionalized. That is the other thing I'm going to talk about, to say it's not just a matter of politicization, but it's a matter of factionalization of the public service, wherein even if you were a political deployee, if you belong to a wrong faction, you suddenly have to depart when that faction loses. And what happened then post-Polokwane is the fact that most of the cadres who were there were then deposed, some from their cabinet positions, some from their public service positions, and so forth. That's when you begin to see a heavy contestation of the political deployment. And these political deployments under the conditions of factionalization were now being done purely on the basis of loyalty rather than capability. Because in the past, you may have had some degree of capacity. How do I arrive at that observation? It's easy if you just observe some of the people who are deposed in after 2007, after 2005, and so forth, as the situation was changing 2009, that most of those cadres were able to go into the private sector and continue making, a success out of that. Some were taken by multinational organizations, including the United Nations. Some were absorbed in the private sector. Some went to the civil society. Some even became academics. So there it tells you that at that particular time, the cadreship did have some professional fallback, did have some business acumen fallback. Now the problem becomes more difficult when during the factionalization there is convergence of not trusting those who were deployed before, because you need to have those you trust the most. So trust became the primary consideration rather than the issue of capacity. Even if it was a political deployment, it was now racing to the bottom in a sense of saying, you get in because you are loyal. And once you do that, it immediately spiraled into a patrimonial system, where patronage system, which then is dithering towards corruption, happened, because once you put in a person who is not capable, that person knows that I'm there at the service of a political head. And therefore they'll do anything that the political head wants them to do if they want this tender to go through, if they want another employment of another political deployee to take place, then that is going to happen. So that created a patrimonial state, which is more of a patronage network. And during that period, you've seen the weakening of institutions of governance and the rise of individual strongmen. When you talk of SABC, in the past, no one even cared who was the CEO there. Later on, you had to know who was the strong man there. You had to know who to go to there. Some were CEOs, some were COOs, and so forth, because power had been wrestled away from the formal institutional arrangement into a more quasi-political arrangement where political influence itself was of priority consideration. That's when corruption started being rife. Then this also led to leadership and policy turnover, where leaders were being removed left and right, DGs removed, DDGs removed because they are suspected to be aligned to the previous person, or they are not moving fast enough to feed the patronage networks of those that had left. So that in itself weakened the institutions and simply transferred the power to individuals. That's overriding any particular institutional memory or governance compliance, as well as the fulfillment of the mandate. That's why you begin to hear concepts such as state capture, such as the ones of irregularities, fruitless expenditure on the scale that has been seen there. Of course, this cascades from national to provincial to local government. Some of these showing extreme forms of weaknesses, extreme forms of politicization, even of technical fields such as being a CFO, a CEO, a CFO, an HR practitioner, and so forth. So there you had misdeployment because of the political approach to public service. So what then you saw there is the fact that the issue of political seniority became a primary consideration instead of professional merit as well as seniority. And politics, as I indicated, became the only avenue of people who otherwise would not have made it to rise as fast as they can, to have a disproportionate influence, and sometimes use the same networks to access resources. At that time, the notion of a developmental state became a figment of imagination. It tilted so far away because of these deep structural problems. Of course, this contradiction of ill-equipped political deployees then led to weak oversight. Over time, even the list to parliament, the committees which were to do oversight, both provincial, national, even in the municipalities, were getting weaker and weaker because some people belonged to so-and-so, who was the regional leader or a provincial leader or a national leader, not because these people were the best amongst us, were capable or understood the national imperatives. This then is the whole ecosystem that goes into political caucuses, where people who have done wrong at times, they go report themselves to the caucuses, not to say how are we going to correct this, but rather to say, how will my political caucus use its majority to defend me, no matter how wrong I might be. That's when now even the legislative branch gets implicated in these particular spaces. So in this particular case, if we had enough time, we would go to each and every case where you see instances of politicization and the impact that they've had on the poor performance and progressively declining performance of the state. Some of these do come out in the Zondo Commission to see how politics and public service had interfaced, to a point where some of the leaders who are being called in of public service are being asked, why did you do this? They say it was political pressure. Why did you do this? I didn't know. Why did you do this? I can't answer. All those things are an indication of the decay that has been happening over time. Some states, if you look at most of your Asian tigers, they became developmental states because they were insisting on professionalization of public service. And some positions, even those which we might deem political positions, such as ministers of science and technology, they insisted on getting some of the top, the brightest, who had, received honors and recognition around the world amongst their peers, who had qualified from the best institutions in the world. And those were the ones who were brought in because they were professionally astute and they could carry the vision that was there, and they had the networks. But in our case, because of the political deployment, it's a person who knows how to manage branches locally, how to spy on who is plotting against who, rather than the main project, which is a developmental state. That's when you start seeing the party itself eating itself alive, because it starts being involved in navel gazing, where most of its energies are consumed by the infighting, by factionalism, by mutual suspicion, by conspiracy theories that are abound, instead of focusing on what the national interests are and how to develop a capable state moving forward. Even the ruling party now, the ANC, has indicated that this particular issue of poor cadre deployment, especially in a factionalized environment, has been a liability that has been dragging the state slowly down a slippery slope. The collapse of state-owned companies is but one of the examples. Remember that state-owned companies ought to have been the engine room for driving any development for the state, any creation of infrastructure for the state, and even give dividends to the states. But now the reverse is the case because they are drawing from the state itself. So this depoliticization of public service, by the way, to be sure, is not just a matter of ANC as a ruling party. We've seen the DA, when it comes, it suspects everybody is from the ANC, even the professionals who may not have been even members of a political party. And they go look for people who have been close associates of the DA. And we've seen other parties as well, when they get a chance, that they'll bring people who are closer to them because they want to create this ecosystem of accessing state resources, using state resources to advance party goals and to advance the resource base of the party. And that in itself, I want to be clear, is not just a matter of a ruling party, ANC. It has spread. It is a societal problem that we ought to be looking into. What must be done then? The first thing is to diagnose the problem correctly, as I indicated, go in depth, understand how each sector this manifests itself in, so that in the recruitment process, you can make a watertight case to make sure that there is no longer appointment of people on the basis of their political alignment, on the basis of their political loyalties, or even if it's factional, but rather people who are undisputably meritocratic in a sense of deserving of the position. The other thing would be, since we already have the civil service, mass training on an intense immersion level of the public service that we have, beyond even the School of Governance, bringing in all different entities to assist, so that the first step is to train public servants who have now been politicized to unlearn that particular tradition and make sure that they relearn something new about professionalization. And that should also happen in a space where they are not threatened by political pressures to take positions which may not be good for the state or good for the public service. You also need to go further and make sure that you do start identifying in the pipeline the best of the best, incentivize them to study in the best institutions, to go have internships in the countries which are already demonstrating what a capable state is. And that training must also be extended to politicians themselves who are deployees, the ministers, the parliamentarians and so forth, so that they begin to understand their role, not in a superficial manner, as to why it is important to work beyond just the majoritarian approach of numbers, why it is important to work just beyond the partisanship, because you belong to this party, therefore you deserve to be appointed even if you may not be capable. So those are some of the things that we could do. Of course, ethical leadership and ethical leadership training is very important. And there you must deal with each individual person who is already in the public service and bring them into deep immersion, not just an awareness program where people go on a workshop 2 days and they just more or less hear what is being said, you do team building, then they are gone. It needs to be a lot more sustained. When I visited Vietnam, I was impressed by their institute of the Political Academy Institute, which trains ministers when they are about to assume their roles in a specific field. It trains some of the public servants each time. And there are many other countries, if you are appointed to a particular board, if it's transport, they are taken into a deep dive 3 months or more for training to know exactly what that sector entails. With us, when we do the boards, and sometimes when we do the appointments, it's simply sympathy for comrade A, comrade B. I saw comrade so-and-so, he doesn't look good, let's put him anywhere. That anywhere could actually be a cumulative effect of downgrading public service through these political appointments. You can't put a person because you feel pity for them. You can't put a person because you say he has been in the struggle for 60 years. Rather, find other means of making sure that those people are catered for rather than to put them in some of these very technical roles. Because once they are there, each time professionals under him or her ask questions and they can't answer, they'll be threatening to go to Lutuli House. They'll be threatening people to say they are not disciplined cadres, when in actual sense, people are insisting on their professional roles. I do think that if we are to turn the situation around in this country, as I conclude, we must attend to the issue of depoliticizing public service and not stop with depoliticizing it, but professionalizing it along the lines of meritocracy and bringing the best of the best into public service, and even be able to attract some people from the private sector to come to public service because it is a compelling space where you can have a professional pride and security of tenure without political interference and disturbance. If we're to fight corruption, one of the ways will be to depoliticize public service. You can't politicize public service in a patronage system and hope that you will end corruption, because you have normalized it, you have made it to be pervasive. And we ought to be taking several examples of developmental state. We are not yet a developmental state today. We might just be a weak state, which is almost a welfare state, but not a developmental state. We therefore have to be asking these questions. For us to become a developmental state, what must we do? And what must each sector, what must each one of us do to make that a reality? I thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was very informative. And you are a patronage political system. So, attitude. You are saying we are struggling in separating the state from the party, and you gave an example of the recent example where state resources were used to transport a political party representative to visit Zimbabwe. You are arguing and say, let's depoliticize the state, but move to also professionalize it and bet on it meritocracy. Thank you so much, Prof, for your submission. We really appreciate. Colleagues, now is your time to make your inputs, your comments, and some questions. I'll take 5 hands, first round. Then I'll allow Prof to make some remarks, then take another 5 hands. So please, colleagues, feel free to raise up your hand first. If you are noted, you must also open your video so that we can know the person that we're talking to. We don't want to speak to people that we don't know. We must see your face. We'll go for David Maimela and Mokwena TR. Galaxy Tap, please rename your gadget so that we can call your name correctly. We can't just say Galaxy Tap. Let's go for David Maimela. Open
thanks.
Maimela.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just about to pull over into my house, so it will be dangerous for me to put on the video.
It's okay. It's understandable.
I'll put it on once I get there. Thanks, Prof. Thank you very much for quite a very illuminating and an incisive input, as it is always the case with you, I must say. I want to start off by saying that I don't want the public service to be depoliticized. And in equal measure, I don't want society as a whole to be depoliticized. Now, I think it's very important that we agree first what is politicization, and then so that we can agree what is depoliticization. I think this is a very important starting point. So for instance, if depoliticization means that the state and government must be apolitical, then I will be against that type of depoliticization, because government and the state, by their very nature and in their origins, are actually political institutions. And governments that are elected periodically have got a responsibility to carry out particular political tasks that must see through a particular mandate or particular vision. I think we have spoken to that point. But if depoliticization means that you are talking about the narrow base or the narrow approach, where it is understood, where deployment is understood to be only narrowly party political, that for me becomes a different form of politicization. Now, I want to come to the point about cadreship deployment, because I make a distinction between the politicization of government or the public service, as well as deployment as a process. And this is why I want to make reference to the United States system. The United States system is very clear. There is a particular echelon of public servants that when Obama leaves, they all leave at the same time, because it's understood that that level is actually attached to the political principle, but it's also attached to the party that is in power at that moment. So in this country, probably we might want to consider that. But also, I want to go further on this matter of deployment, and I want to make an example to contrast two institutions. You were right, Prof. The idea of anywhere is actually problematic. To contrast the two institutions, for instance, the SABC, which I am part of, and the Competitions Commission, which I was part of. Very few people probably know that the commissioner of the Competition Commission actually has more or less 30 years of activism in the African National Congress. Why is that the case? It's because in terms of deployment into those institutions, some of them, like the Competition Commission, meritocracy was never undermined and dropped. So you have had the commissioner having had those years. You have had myself having served there as a chief of staff. I've got 22 years in the ANC. You have the entire executive of the Competitions Commission, which sits in the commission meeting, by the way. None of them has got less than a master's degree, and some of them have got more than one. So in other words, what I'm trying, when you contrast that with the SABC, you find something else. Of course, the SABC of now, of the past 2 years, with the new management and the new board, is different from the one that was there before. But when you contrast the two, they are far apart. Then you get a sense that this is not, when you look at the SABC of the recent past, it gives you an indication that this is not how deployment ought to be done. And then when you look at the Competitions Commission, you'll find that this is how deployment ought to be done. Now, we can agree as a country, as it is the case in all other countries, Prof, you are correct, that deployment can only be restricted to this level of seniority and leadership in an institution. But of course, if we agree that at SAA we will deploy a CEO, then the CEO and their management will see how they fill up the rest. The assumption would always be, I don't know how you get out of that. The assumption would always be that if the CEO is aligned to this or the other political party, therefore everyone else appointed below that CEO is actually a party stooge. So which brings me to the point that actually, if you look at the meritocratic model of China, the issue is never that the party must not deploy or that it's problematic for a party to deploy. And that once the party is deployed, therefore that is termed as politicization. The issue is whether the party is willing to stick through and without fail and compromising to the best amongst itself and the best within society to actually lead those institutions. Because once those institutions are led by the best amongst us, nobody actually cares. I mean, nobody really cares of the political background of the commissioner of the Competition Commission. As one example, I'm sure there's many other shining examples out there. But I'm simply saying that what has actually gone wrong, let's not shy away, let's put it openly. What has actually gone wrong is that you have a political party that is not willing to correct this element of meritocracy. And why is that the case? Of course, the Prof has spoken about the patronage system. Until we correct that, we won't be able to do it. And the next party that comes to government, whether in the Western Cape or in Tswana and so on, will follow the same model because that's how the whole system works. Now, my last point, it comes back to another broader point, Prof, which I always argue about. That if you do not take care of transforming the economy and making it more broader and more inclusive and transformed, the worst of elements in the political class and the political establishment will find themselves in public service, and they will bring down the state, they will bring down the party, they'll bring down government, because the only way of social mobility for those people actually becomes political institutions. And that's where the problem actually lies. So the economy, the transformation of the economy cannot be divorced from the nature of the state and the government that you want to build. I know that, for instance, Greek families across Pretoria and Joburg, just as a final example, those families every weekend, every Saturday or Sunday, they've got lunches. And so what they do, they own the spas, as you know, the spa supermarkets. And so what they do is that they gather, those lunches are actually social capital lunches. So when they gather in December or towards the end of the year, then they ask how many of these kids are actually struggling at school and are not making it beyond matric. They say, oh, so-and-so is struggling, really, we don't have a hope that we can take them to Harvard. And these are people with lots of money. So what they do is that then they say, well, there's a spa there in Centurion. We will take them there. It will be an understudy for 2 years below that manager there. After that, they take over the thing. So the politics, if you do not transform the economy, the politics are also going to take a rotten posture and they are going to degenerate. Thanks.
Should I answer or wait for the other questions? Program Director, should I answer?
Yeah, you can answer, Prof.
Yes. I think it is very important to answer these very pointed questions because they are at the heart of what we are discussing here. And they are quite profound. I really appreciate the manner you've raised them. To me, I do think that I started by saying it is impossible to depoliticize every level of public service or even the state project itself. However, as it is the case in other countries, there are certain levels. In fact, in the US, it goes up to the university. When a vice chancellor, who they call president there, comes in, he comes with his cabinet. The person who is going to head academic, the registrar, the whatnot. When his term or her term is over, they leave so that you come up with your own employees. But there are those below those levels who are professionally there, who do not change no matter who comes in and out to maintain institutional memory. The first thing I want to say, when I talk of politicization, I'm clear that I'm talking about two things. The partisan vulgarization of political deployments, where the party wants to control everything, which has become worse over the years, precisely because the ruling party's own internal problems have become the problems that spilled over to the public service itself. So that is the first problem that we are now faced with. The second one is the fact that you do have an element here of a political project that I would say political project ought to be the one of national interest. What is the broader national interest that we're dealing with? So that this political project that we're talking about is not interfered with by the partisan problems. So that in itself is the failure to have this grand vision that I was talking about. Virtually every developmental state, from China, Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, and many others, Lee in South Korea and so forth. There was this political project, but it was a grand vision to invite everybody to say, come in, whether you are from PAC, Azapo, whether you are from, you are not even politically aligned, because meritocracy had become the key thing. You can only say, come in to fulfill this particular project. But you can't then say, I monopolize this project, because the only people who will ever understand it are our own political cadres. That can't be. The party must work towards selling itself and making sure that the entire population, professionals, intellectuals, and business sector, the unions and so forth, buy into their vision because it coincides with the national interest project. But if it cannot do that, it is the generalized politicization for the sake of politicization. It is the generalized infighting within the party, which has no ideological pinning. So politicization here is mainly very specific to the South African condition as to how these wrong deployments have actually brought in politics in a vulgar form within the public service itself. No matter which way you look at it, if you say, for example, you are bringing in a person who has merit but is an activist, the reason the leadership of the Competitions Commission is successful is because, one, they may have insulated themselves from the political pressures, which could have come and say, don't investigate this case, investigate that case. Two, they are professionally capable and the merit is there. to a point where they know, even if we leave this space, we can go work elsewhere. But once you put a person who spends the first 5 years permanently shocked that at last they have found a particular position they never even dreamt of, that person will not recover from the shock. Instead, they'll shock all other professionals to leave because their insecurities and the fact that they are still having to service the person who deployed them there means the politicization that we have is at a very base partisan level within a patronage system. And even if you were to use any other term in South Africa, I think the average person, if you said technically, there is nothing wrong with politicization, they would struggle to understand. But when you say the political project should be the grand scale of where the nation goes, not what the partisan issues are, that is where the problem is. When ANC came with RDP, it was both a political project born out of a political consultation, but at the same time, it had risen to the level of coinciding with the national interest. Therefore, it had elevated itself from just being a partisan political project into being a national project. So if you go to my village and say, no, we still want to politicize the public service because it has to, they will not understand. In the South African level, the nomenclature is, oh, you mean the cadre deployment, or you mean bringing in people because they say they were in Robben Island or in Lusaka, or you mean you bring somebody because they say they were in Psycho and so forth. So that, to me, the issue of merit, and here depoliticization shouldn't be saying there should be no ideology, there should be no political project, as long as it coincides with the national interest. But if the political project is the one of the regional chair who wants to recycle someone who has failed somewhere, then that political project is the wrong politicization itself. And I'm not even sure if we may succeed if we say we want to split hair in the South African context and say, let's bring back the politicization of public service. However, it should be understood differently because there will be merit. What has brought us where it is? It's the vulgar notion of politics. But the most important thing that you also raised was a simple one, which I often repeat anywhere else. If you don't transform the economy, if you don't make it inclusive, and if you do not empower people, and if you do not actually even create space even within civil society, because other people may just want to be social entrepreneurs. They may not want to be in business. And some of the people may want to be other things as long as there's security of revenue, there's security and comfort in the life they want to lead. If you do not do that, then you have forced everybody into a bottleneck of chasing politics because they see that so-and-so became a municipal manager. Now they have 4 houses. That's where lifestyle audit becomes very important. As a matter of fact, because if you're earning 2 million, all of a sudden, because you have assumed this position, you suddenly now have 7 properties everywhere else, then it is telling you that there is a problem within this particular space. So that is why meritocracy and insulating the system from the politics becomes very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for responding. We go to Spiwe Moyo, and followed by Galaxy Tap.
Thank you, Sediko. Hope you guys can hear me.
Switch on your, yeah, we can hear you, Moyo.
Yeah, it is on. Yes, sir. I won't say much. Thanks for the presentation, Prof. And greetings to the host and everybody else. I have few things. In fact, I don't have much. What I want to ask the professor, do you think in every problem that we are facing in this country, whether you are talking about economy, whether you are talking about issues of social cohesion, and so many things, do you honestly think that parties, political parties that are in charge of our legislature
I lost you there.
Moyo? Yeah, Moyo, we have lost you. Maybe in the meantime, let's go to Mokoena.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
From the presentation of Prof, I think it's very much clear the problem is when infighting of political parties are overlapping to the state. It's when the factions of political parties are no longer being the political parties alone, but affects the service delivery. And number two is when incapable cadre is being deployed in the government because they feel pity for that particular cadre, but this does not have a capacity to deliver. And I think Prof is so correct. But one other matter that we need to look into, Prof, if you can also answer me on that, I will also quote what Obama said, that Africa does not need strong men, but strong institutions. But to add further, it does not mean that the quote from Obama is so 100% correct. But if we have a strong institution, the strong institution will be able to expose such, actually not allow such people who are not capable to be leaders amongst the state. We lack a strong institution. If we've got a strong institution like what is happening in America, whether it's Democrat or it's Republican, whether it's Trump, but if the institution of the state is strong, the institution itself will be able to direct the policy direction of a particular political party that is in charge. But if our institutions in South Africa are not strong, we'll be seeing such things happening amongst ourselves. And I don't think Prof is saying that people who are members of political parties should not be in government. But Prof is saying those who are incapable should not be there, because we're compromising service delivery. The best amongst us, including those who are in political parties, must be able to lead, must be able to take charge in state institution. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much
Thank you
for
so
that.
much, Mokoena. Before I give Prof an opportunity to answer, the question might be: can you build strong institutions in an environment that is politically toxic, highly factionalized, and characterized by patronage? Because Mokoena talks about building strong institutions, but the question will be: can you build that kind of institution in an environment that is highly politicized, very toxic, factionalized, and surviving through patronage? Over to you, Prof, to respond to Mokoena.
Thank you very much, Ndatemkwena. A pity that Ubaba Moyo, when he was about to ask about the character of political parties, his line failed him there. The first thing is to say that, indeed, if it was a meritocratic institution, it wouldn't matter whether you say you were once an ANC, you were once COPE, you are EFF and so forth. Self-evidently, you can demonstrate your capability. It wouldn't matter if, for example, you wanted to appoint Dalimpofu a judge, or you make him DG of the Justice Department, because you know he has demonstrated his skill as a legal mind. It doesn't matter that he might have been with the EFF. The only thing you deal with is the issue of saying now you can't be active at high levels, you can't be partisan in the work that you're going to do. Similarly, if you're ANC cadre and you're capable, it is very important that you should not be prejudiced because of other mishappenings elsewhere and so forth. The problem that we have is this notion that there is a certain rank ordering of things. If you are in Robben Island, you must be first in line. If you were in exile, combat, or Lusaka, you must be first in line. If you are, your time is coming, then by the time people occupy certain positions, they are using this thing of struggle credentials as a way of forcing themselves in, and at times not even understanding the fact that if you were in Robben Island, by this time you ought to have to be playing with your great-great-grandchildren. You might be older, you are in your pension years. So there should be other ways of honoring you or not making you vulnerable, rather than simply throwing you there because you have this rather impressive struggle credentials. For example, if Fourth Industrial Revolution is the key thing to take us forward, if investigation into the cure of COVID-19 is the key thing in the pharmaceutical investigations, it has no bearing on whether you were in Robben Island or Lusaka and so forth. It simply needs people who are innovative, and most of those people are young. Look at how average age in Africa and in South Africa in the cabinet is. We're in the 60s. And yet you look at Canada, the premier there was 39 when he came in his early 40s. Finland just appointed a 33-year-old and so forth. But for us, we have started to put so much premium on the history you remember, whether you were in Morogoro and so forth, instead of using that heritage in a useful manner, instead of putting people in positions awkward where they fail. That is the main problem, which becomes awkward, and then they retaliate politically, some of them. Let me put it clearly in a very crude manner. Some of us participated in the struggle. Yes, we were young. We went into prisons. But we can't come back and use that to jump the queue, even if we do not have merit for that, because our struggle was not the kind of a person who was brought in there as a mercenary to say, I'll fight for you, you are poor, when we have won, give me a mine or something. That's a mercenary mentality. We should be saying, amongst us, we see this young, bright person who is so good that with Fourth Industrial Revolution, they'll take us to another world. It doesn't need to be a person who is having all these struggle credentials, with time past, because the struggle in essence might have ended in the 90s, and therefore you can't still use that as the litmus test to bring in people. Bring people who are capable, bring people who are the best of the best. That is the main thing. And when it comes to the toxic environment that we have currently. It's a very important thing. Unfortunately, institutions and strong institutions don't build themselves. You need first to strengthen leadership and have leadership that has vision, that has conviction. Everywhere else where you have seen things turn around, whether it's Dubai becoming a financial and a property, magnet, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Malaysia, South Korea, it's China, and many others, even Rwanda next door, it takes a strong leader. Some of them, of course, may not have all the democratic credentials. That I admit. It takes a strong leader. Even in Brazil, when Lula came in, he had a vision, he stuck to it. In 10 years, you could see things turning around. He is pulled off and others take over, things start going down. So it's a leader who can deal with the toxicity, who can persuade the nation, who can rally people. And once that is done, then you begin to deal with the issue of creating institutions. Then institutions are built to a sustainable level where even if now weak leaders come later and they go, and sometimes you do have these coalition chaos or anarchy, the system is embedded and strong. It is institutionalized. It now has systems of employing through merit. It no longer takes any political influence, but it still follows that particular path. That in itself is what we can do if we're to deepen our democracy and become a developmental state. Start with strong leadership. That strong leadership, among other mandates, is to detoxify public service, is to generally depoliticize public service and the cadre deployment and bring in merit as a fact. And once you have done that, over time it grows, it becomes embedded. It's not easy to destroy institutions. Even now, those which started caving and collapsing, it was after several efforts, after some years of trying to destroy them, chasing away capable people, ethical leaders, until they caved in. So building leadership, which understands that building capable state and institutions is one of the key mandates, and transforming our economy to create a situation where you decentralize the focus of opportunities so that politics is not the only way of social mobility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. We'll go to Robert Maswanganye, Galaxy Tab S4, and Wiseman Dlela. These will be the last hands because I've been requesting hands to come, but these are the only last three hands. Robert Maswanganye, Galaxy Tab S4, and Wiseman Dlela, in that order.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think the presentation was very good, and we really appreciate the information that you have empowered us with. And again, to the host, Mr. Rakolote. My question is, I hear that there are principles that our organization has in terms of the best among us. I'm just quoting through the eye of the needle. And then in terms of the policy and the principle, those things are written, but we are not following it. And if you check, for example, now people are talking about the reshuffle, that the minister might, the president might reshuffle the ministers. And then one of the things that becomes a problem is that if you know that you are working under a certain minister, the moment they reshuffle and your minister is out of the cabinet, it becomes a problem because the new minister comes with the new people, and then you find that you are actually taken out, and then where we can say it's patronage. Nonetheless, my simple question, or in short, is there a hope in our organization that very soon we'll see these policies that we have it in black and white being implemented? Because we do talk about it. We talk about, I mean, from local government, provincial and national, to say we need the best among us. The policy in itself has those kind of things. But in terms of implementation, come the time where, for example, if we say Comrade Sediko Rakolote becomes the president or minister, he might align to say, no, I think I know Robert, let me put him as a DG. Are we going to have a time, or is there a hope in our country where you can say very soon we'll divert and apply the policy that we have at its best without compromising? Because at this point, the cadre deployment is the one that is actually taking our country down, as you have said. I think the others have been said by the other colleagues. Thank you very much. I hope it is clear what I've said.
Thank you, Ndade Maswanganye. And I made a mistake of not requesting you to switch on your video, but I suspect that you're driving, you can't switch off your video. Ndade Wiseman Vela, please come in before Prof will answer. I'm struggling to unmute the Galaxy tab S4. Wiseman Vela, please come in.
Thank you, Chair, and also thank you, Program Director. And thank you, Prof, for the presentation. I just have one question that I'd like to ask. Prof, what is your take on the issue of people who are serving in multiple positions of leadership and authority within the question that we are discussing today? Let's make an example of the ruling party, because in any case, it's a leader of government. What do you think of quite a number of people who are in the NEC positions, but also they are also members of parliament? You can even go down to provincial government and local government and take the same scenario. What do you think of that as a factor as well in politicization of public service? Thanks.
Thank you, Wiseman Vela. Prof, you can come in.
Thank you very much for this input. The first one, I do think that Tundate Maswanganye, it would take not just political party alone, because what if the ruling party has gone beyond its ability to self-correct because contradictions have become so deep and existential? For example, right now, the fight against corruption is being factionalized and weaponized as a political tool. Even the issue of radical economic transformation is being factionalized and weaponized as a tool, where if you say, let's fight corruption, they say you are CR. If you say, let's transform the economy, they say you are NDZ, and others fashion themselves as being the true champions of the radical economic transformation, and others are sellouts, others are actually using the state to fight us and so forth. So we have reached a point where you ask yourself a question: is the ruling party still in a position to unwiggle itself from this cobweb, which is destructive? And this is going to be worse with the State Capture Commission, with the prosecutions coming, because there things will get worse and it will get outright dirty and nasty. And with some people who are likely to be jailed, you are going to have instances. Take, for example, an Andile Lungisa situation, very unrelated situation. Somebody hits with another one with a bottle, and then he appeals and appeals and lose all the appeals. And when that has failed, the same thing is dragged into a factional battle, which means anything within the ruling party, no matter how remote it might be, will always land itself in this particular space. In the next NGC, it might be another battleground to say, let's try again and see if we can't dislodge the current leadership. So there is a sense in me to say, let's look beyond the ruling party. If the ruling party happen to have strong leadership that escapes and renew the organization, that will be well and good. But let's begin to look at all multiple leaderships emerging in the society. let's look at the civil society, because I still believe if we have a social movement that is akin to the mass democratic movement that we had in the 80s and is clear in putting pressure on all political formations as to what should and should not be done in its name, then within that context, it would be easy to deal with some of these challenges on the basis, of putting pressure from a social movement, which is not partisan. Because the partisanship now has become a problem. If you are EFF, there is a certain EFF reality. You defend things, whether they are wrong or right. If you are ANC, you defend things, whether they are wrong or right. If you are DA, you are even inconsistent in the policy and the principles that you talked about. So to me, I do think that going back and empowering the public to insist on these things which are right and correct, and to punish those who do not follow the line, might just be the beginning of a revolution or transformation at a fundamental level. But to wait for self-correction of certain political formations, it may actually have to wait for a very long time while the country, especially post-COVID-19, especially in its economic crisis, the country, by the time the party self-correct, will have collapsed. It's as simple as that. Or something decisive, and the party suddenly has the Damascus moment. It wakes up and say, all this was wrong. It's going to lead us to be punished, and we are going to fail miserably in the next election. Let's do something differently, maybe, or maybe. The political reform the reform of the electoral system, if creatively formed in a manner that also reinforces meritocracy, it takes away from the party, barons who simply use the party list as a way, or even changing the manner we elect leaders of political parties. Why not try something like the Labour Party in UK does, where every member, if you have 1 million members, is able to vote using their biometric or using their code or password from home? Then you won't have money and politics where people have to buy somebody in order to get into a particular branch, and the branch has to eliminate every other person in order to be a delegate in a conference. Then in a conference, you have to use this influence and the patronage system. You need to uproot the entire patronage system. Then you'll begin to see a newer world where we go back to define what the national interest is, what the national blueprint for development is, and how do we go for reconstruction in the post-COVID and in the aftermath of all the failed policies and failed programs that we've had. Thank you.
Chair, am I allowed?
Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you.
For your comment. I think we all agree that a factionalized highly politicized public services to its citizens. I'm sure all of us, we know examples within municipalities whereby there are allegations of even RDP houses being given to a particular faction of a certain political party. The way the patronage system works, instead of giving the services to the needy, you choose ones between your mercenaries to say, I'll give this house to this one because when you go to the next conference, this person is likely to mobilize forces for me to imagine the next conference. So a highly politicized, toxic, and a system that survives through patronage will never succeed in becoming a vehicle for developmental state. That's what the submission has been made by Prof. Colleagues, we thank you for participating in this webinar of today. Thank you so much, Prof, for availing yourself and making submissions. We are humbly honored to have you here. Thanks to all participants. As Progressive Socio-Economic Investment Institute Trust, we'll continue having this kind of discussions because it is through discussions, it's through dialogue that we can build our state. Thank you so much, and we wish you a blessed afternoon. It's level 1 now. Level 1 does not mean that COVID-19 is gone. Please be safe, take care, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.